lot of traction on YouTube with this topic because it is arguably one of the biggest scandals in evangelical history. And so even the secular media was covering this. It's one of the reasons I think it's important for Christians to speak out and speak truthfully about the situation.
This podcast is going to be looking somewhat in the aftermath of the reports that came out regarding sexual misconduct by Ravi Zacharias, who is maybe one of the world's most popular or influential Christian apologists in our lifetime. And so the point of this podcast will be less to cover exactly what happened, or to look at the official reports and stuff that came out. And if you want more information on those types of things, we'll definitely have links and all to Jason's YouTube channel, which will have where he's covered that in a lot more detail. And I know you spent a lot of time answering people's comments and stuff that they've had for that. So that'll be a resource that we can send people over to. But we really wanted to take today as an opportunity to really evaluate our own hearts and our lives and look at how we can guard them, because obviously anytime something like this happens with a really big leader in the faith, so to speak, it causes a lot of confusion, and it also can be a good time to say, hey, we ought to look at our own lives and guard ourselves, because if Ravi can fall, that's something that we ought to look at for ourselves as well.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think, one, the victims need to know that we as a church are going to speak into this. We're going to understand what were the things that led to this, because we never want to have it happen again. And silence on something like this, I think, says to the victims that we don't care and we're not willing to change. Right. And I'm with you as well. It's an opportunity for all of us to look in the mirror and say, hey, what were some of the ingredients that we saw in Ravi Zacharias' life, and how do I see myself moving in that same direction?
Right. And unfortunately, I know this is something that you probably talk a lot about on your YouTube channel, and I know we've talked about before, but even if you're not somebody that's listened to Ravi Zacharias before, or if he's not, in your world, this type of stuff is happening all around us all of the time. And so I know that's something that we see happens to many, many other big-time church leaders, as well as just people that are in our community. And I know, here where I'm located in Greenville, South Carolina, I know there's even a lot of trafficking problems and stuff like that go along. So this is something I think really relevant, not just with the Ravi situation, but really to look at because of the abuse that's going on around us all the time.
And there's definitely a sense that all of us are led to compromise. And, I just think about my own life. If I, God forbid, was to fall into a major sin, you just wouldn't hear about it because I don't have the reach that Ravi had. And
Right.
So maybe if somebody who has a construction job struggles with something like this, falls into a sin like that, it just doesn't make CNN, like the Ravi situation
Right.
did. And so in that same way, it's not so much this is something only major Christian pastors would struggle with, but rather it's the reality of our hearts, where we're drawn. It's the direction that our flesh will lead us.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so that's kind of what I hope to do with the podcast today, is to take this thing and not just cover the news of it, but look at bringing this personally now. And that's been really something on my heart. I talked a bit about on one of our prior episodes on resolutions and how resolutions are really a worship problem, about some of my own personal resolutions that I've been working through that are more life resolutions, not just New Year's resolutions, but life resolutions. And one of them was basically whenever I'm sitting across the table from somebody, or in this case, reading about, or whatever that looks like, whenever I see their own sins, when I see their flaws, when I see their failures, not to take that as an opportunity of saying, oh gosh, I'm so thankful that I'm not like that, or that I haven't done that, or I haven't sinned in that way, but instead to see their own sins as if they were my own, and use that as a cause for me to confess my own sins, use that as an opportunity to do a heart evaluation, to look and see that, apart from the grace of God, that same progression that Ravi ended up on, that's maybe where I would be heading too, and to use this as an opportunity to guard my heart as well.
So as you think about that, what have been some of the things that have really stirred up in you given this Ravi situation?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, because one of the things that I've been wondering a lot about is how he got to where he's at, right? Because I think that that's one of the things for me of why that resolution has really been in my heart, is to see like there's a definite progression to sin, whereas as we allow small footholds in our lives, it begins to grow and grow and grow. And so I've been really wondering, how does somebody get to that point, and how can we catch those things earlier in our lives, and then also even just wondering, how do those types of things go hidden in a life as well for that long. And so those are definitely some things I'd be really interested in talking about. I don't know if you could kind of maybe then help us open that up with, I don't know that we'll know exactly how Ravi progressed into abusing women, but what does that progression then often look like? What do those first steps often look like for especially men as they are progressing into those first steps before even like the deeper offenses, so to speak?
And unfortunately, with Ravi having passed away, we're never going to hear his story, his side of it. As far as we know, he didn't confide in anyone. But I have wondered, I'm with you, that what was the first area of compromise? And earlier in the week, I listened to Josh McDowell, who was very close with Ravi, and they were contemporaries in the field of apologetics. And he was asked if he thought Ravi had been a fraud all along. And he said absolutely not, that he thinks there was at some point some compromise and some hidden sin. And so I've kind of wondered, was it digital? Was it what we saw in some of this investigation with texting and sexting, asking for explicit pictures from women? Is that something that started, you can think early in the 2000s, we were able to start doing picture messaging and things like that.
Yeah.
Was it digital with pornography? Was it a flirting thing, an emotional affair? It's really hard to say, but I think those are probably some of the ingredients that he would have had opportunity to start with given where he ended up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think I often, whenever you see someone, especially, more famous like that, you assume that, oh, they just have the money and prowess or whatever to just jump in on that kind of stuff. But it's a good point too to recognize, that a lot of the means to get into some of these different things didn't start maybe until around the year 2000 and stuff. But it's interesting to think about what that progression might look like even then in our own personal lives, apart from just the fame of being able to get whatever you want. So do you see that then for most people, just the normal person in the congregation of your church, is the progression typically going to start then with like digital content, things like that?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I think if you hear people's stories, we're drawn to different things. Obviously, given the nature of technology and our smartphones, the digital arena is the easiest avenue to fall into sexual sin. And I would say for most of us, that's the first compromise. It's looking at some things we shouldn't look at. Then given the texting and trying to engage in, we talk about digital courage, how people are, when they're separated by the pixels on a screen, they're able to ask for things or say for things that they wouldn't say in person. So that can also be an easy spot to start with the compromise. And I think with ministers, and one of the things you originally texted me after I put out my first video on the reporting was it was making you rethink the whole celebrity Christian movement. And part of that reality is that for a minister to confess your sin, especially if you're a big name celebrity like Ravi, you are risking it all. He's risking those big conferences. He's risking the book deals, all of the prestige that he had built around his own name. I mean, his ministry was named after him. And so for him, I just wonder if there was even more pressure when that first compromise happened to say, no, I can handle this, and I'm going to keep it in. And if you're in a regular business vocation and you want to come confess at your church, it probably won't affect your job. But as a minister, it could really affect everything. And I've really wondered if that was part of why it was easy for him to really have decades of hidden sin.
Yeah. Yeah, the celebrity worship leader culture is a really interesting thing. It's one that's been, I know, something a lot of people have been talking about recently because of Ravi Zacharias and others before him who have been in that position. And to me, it seems like such a position of just pressure, because there's so much pressure on you from so many different sides, and it seems like the opportunity then for sin just becomes so great. But again, to look at my own life and reflect on that, one of the things I was thinking about with this is, celebrity culture doesn't necessarily mean you actually have a lot of followers or following. When I was in high school leading our worship team, we had maybe 20 people in our youth group. And I remember thinking, man, I am just the coolest. Like, I'm up here with the guitar and I'm really something. And, there was like 3 people in the crowd that also thought I was really cool because I did that. And it's interesting how that same mentality of that celebrity worship pastor or celebrity pastor culture can really infiltrate even apart from being known. There's really an issue with finding yourself in a position where you perceive to have power or you perceive to be something really important, because that's just, to me, was just something that grew and grew and grew my pride, which seems like it transitions very unfortunately very naturally into things like sexual sin.
Yeah, I think there's that allure of fame, and there's that influence of desiring power. And this is where you and I get to look in the mirror. I've got a YouTube channel. You and Logan have a podcast. And let's be honest, like, our hearts are that God would grow our influence, that people would be subscribing and they'd be listening and they'd be talking about it. And, if someone texts me and says, hey, I watched that video that you put out, it was awesome. Then my heart gets a little or my brain, I guess, gets a hit of dopamine, and I get excited. Yep. And so right there in my own heart, in my own life, I'm seeing that draw to that celebrity culture. It's one thing for me to say, hey, I got into the ministry because I want to help people, but yet my sin and my flesh are here that I want to make my name grow, and it's easy to not check that if we're not careful.
Yep. That is the constant battle, I feel like, in all the areas of ministry in which I help and serve, because the markings of success for so many ministries are looked at from how many people are you reaching, and it's difficult because it ends up doing exactly what we're talking about, where if you reach the success, then it swells your pride, and if you're not, then you get into a mode of frustration, and both a heart of bitterness and a heart of pride end up often leading down toward paths of sin. And so that's just, to me, it's such a thing that we need to be thinking about and focused on, even if your reach is not, Ravi, arguably was reaching millions of people, right? I'm, reaching tens of people, but it's still one of those things where it's an issue that I've got to be aware of and be facing as well.
And it's been interesting for me to reflect on Ravi's life and to realize that for probably 25 years, he couldn't go into any church, certainly not any church in America, but probably a lot of churches around the world, without being the biggest deal that people would flock around to, probably want his autograph, absolutely want to talk to him. And just think of the influence that you can't even go to worship and just come before God. And it's almost like when you show up in the church, you're God.
Yeah.
And that's an extreme place to be for a long period of time, where people are giving you that reverence. I got to see it here at Clemson in 2011 when Ravi Zacharias came into town to do a speaking gig, because there were a lot of the Ravi fanboys that came from hours and hours away, and just the way they talked about him. And it's I think different of it now, given how his life ended, than I did at the time. At the time, I just kind of thought, man, these guys are really into Ravi Zacharias. But you see just that influence of celebrity.
Yeah. And to me, one of the biggest dangers of that, with that swelling of pride, is that you start to feel a sense of power and to crave that power. And I don't know, I'm sure that this is something that you've seen in some of the work that you've been doing with Soulfire, but to me, it seems like one of the primary motivators behind like pornography usage is a sense of power. And so I think the same is probably true for a lot of sexual abuse and sexual sins, to where that type of celebrity status leads to a pride, which leads to a craving for power, which often leads to these types of sins.
Yeah. And then with that, when you have that reputation, one of the victims said the reason she didn't tell anyone is because who would believe her versus this famous Christian leader? And that's just so heartbreaking, that there was just this reality that his reputation prevented him from accusation. And that's a scary place for sure.
Yeah. So we talked a bit about, where does this come from? And so I think, a lot of people are going to understand the idea of avoiding first steps, right? Of avoiding that first, plunge into something like this. But let's talk a little bit then about that next step, because obviously, again, you don't necessarily progress just straight from, you looked at something online that you shouldn't, to now you're running spas, and there's this wide scale abuse that's going on. How do things progress that far, I guess?
Well, I think a lot of people who responded to some of the videos I did are in complete denial that it could be even possible. And I think what they fail to acknowledge is a couple of things. One is the prevalence of lies, and then just the power of somebody who is a master manipulator. And so for me, what happens is it's hidden sin and it's compromise. And then the more you do it, you have to lie and cover in order to keep that going. And I think when the dust settled in the life of Ravi Zacharias, and people who were very close to him were shocked, one of the things that we realize is that he really was a master manipulator. And unfortunately, in my life, I've at least 3 times met chronic liars and people who are master manipulators. Now, nowhere near the degree to which Ravi was. But when you work with addicts, one of the quotes from Ted Roberts, who founded the Conquer series, is Ted says, addicts lie. And if you're going to keep an addiction, the way you keep that and prevent people from stopping you is you have to surround it with lies. And that to me was kind of that next step from compromise and hidden sin, is now you're living a life of lies and manipulation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful to think about, especially in Ravi's case, because when I look at it, it's interesting to see that many of the strengths that would make somebody a good apologist, right, like a good arguer, so to speak, there's also many weaknesses that come with that. And one of those naturally is going to be the ability to manipulate, the ability to anticipate arguments and to anticipate accusations and things like that, and have planned responses, and be able to work around the system. That's been something from my reading up on the reports and looking at it. It appears that that's part of the problem, is that he knew how to work around his own systems even.
Yeah, it said that he was the architect of his own accountability. So he had multiple phones with him at any given time, and he was really able to get around any accountability that he had put into place. And I think it's important, the way you're talking about that manipulation, because for ministers who have minister gifting, ministry gifts, one of the things that I frequently say is that the gifts that God has given us, we can use either to love and serve others, or we can take those gifts and use and abuse other people. Now, real basic example, if you're physically strong and God has just made you, kind of a beast, right? Well, you can take your strength and harm people, right? You could abuse women because you're stronger than them. Or you could say, God has made me strong. I'm going to protect the vulnerable. I'm going to protect children. Maybe God's calling you into a field to really use that strength to protect against evil, right? Ministry example is, if God has made you gifted in counseling and you can really draw people out, and you just have a knack for understanding what's going on in their heart, well, you can use that to serve people and to really heal wounding and brokenness. Or, and unfortunately, this is what we find in the investigation that Ravi was doing, he was drawing people in and getting them to a place of trust. And once he had their trust, that's when he would slowly move into the abuse. So he was taking actually the gifts God gave him, and he was using them to use and abuse. And so I think the same as you talk about the worship leader, if a worship leader if he has incredible worship gifts, if he simply wants to make a name for himself, you've probably seen it before, how women can be attracted to a popular worship leader. They can kind of use that power, use that attraction to gain trust, to gain friendship that, without those gifts, they wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, that's so true, especially when you think about the worship leader, because in many ways, the very giftings which enable someone to most effectively point to God can be used to most effectively point to themselves.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's something that's so prevalent on the stage, and something that's really been on my mind is, thinking about, everything from the way you dress on stage to what words you are saying and songs you're picking and your attitude and everything. It all can be used to point to God, and it can all be used to point to yourself. And it's interesting, especially like with these cases. So like not even just in terms of like a sexual immorality, but like all of our different sins. Like it just takes little footholds and little hidden sins, little compromises and things like that, to where you can end up leading on stage and it being all about yourself. And I mean, that's something that, I mean, I've seen in my own life as a worship leader, where there have been times where I lead and the entire thing is thinking about what are people thinking about how my voice sounds right now. And, you know, you throw up an angry face because you missed a note. And, you know, in hindsight now, I look back and I realize, like, you know, in my mind was thinking, I want people to know that I missed that note, so they don't think I'm a poor player. And in reality, like, that means they looked at my face and they were distracted from God in that moment. And so there's just so many things where I think that this is such an important thing to talk about, of that idea of letting sin and small compromises in your life grow. And as you try to hide those and manipulate to keep that, you know, under wraps, so to speak, it can become something where, like you said, you're using your gifts for the entirely wrong reason.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was interesting. One of my favorite comments on the second Ravi video that I made after the investigation was somebody just said, "How do we know you don't have a hidden life of sin?" Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think the person's trying to take a shot at me, which is fine. But I replied to them and I said, that is the correct answer. You don't. Mm-hmm. That I'm a talking head on YouTube, and, you know, Andrew and Logan are talking heads on podcasts, but we don't see how... They don't see how we're treating our wives at home, or how I'm treating my children. You know, they don't know what's on my history on my phone. And so I said to this person, that's exactly the point. So don't put me on a pedestal. Don't make me a Christian celebrity. Don't worship somebody who has influence on like YouTube or worship, a worship team or something like that. Instead, we've got to look to Christ, and we have to make sure that person, like me, has a local group, has some men in my life that I'm accountable to, has accountability in place right here, because it can't be the commenters in YouTube putting me in check.
Yeah, right. And that's another good point, you know, on the celebrity pastor culture of, you have all these people who their pastor is a celebrity that they've never met, that has no input on their life. And we spend so little face-to-face time with people now. And, yeah, it's interesting. That's, you know, again, that also just points to, you know, the idea of like the Berean church, where they, you know, looked at everything through the filter of Scripture. And the hope is that, yeah, even this conversation we're having right now, people should be filtering that through there, because we don't have face-to-face time with those people. And I think one of the key words there, and you mentioned this earlier, was accountability. We don't have accountability with those people. But so do you think is accountability, is that the best manner for us to protect ourselves against walking down these paths of sin, including the path that Ravi took?
Well, I certainly think it's one of the key ingredients. One of the other things I wonder for celebrity pastors and celebrity ministers is, are they still meeting with the Lord themselves? Yeah. You know, when you first start out in ministry and you're terrified and you pray because you're given that first sermon and it was probably terrible, but you prayed before and you prayed after because you had a sense of inadequacy. But when you've been preaching, you know, knockout sermons for a decade and you get nothing but praise, I wondered, are you on your knees asking God to bless that sermon? Are you up early reading the Bible, still doing the scripture memory, the things that really drove you into ministry, that heart for ministry, or do they slowly fade over time? So I thought about that. What was the personal life, the personal devotion life with the Lord? Outside of that, absolutely, where's the accountability? Who are those men who had access to him? And it seems like there wasn't anyone in the life of Ravi Zacharias. By one comparison, Josh McDowell was saying that he has two men in his life who have full access to anything. They can have his phone, read his email, they can be with him on those trips and things like that. But obviously for the celebrity pastor, you know, it'd be a lot harder because people kind of look at you like you're larger than accountability. Yeah.
Yeah, they probably look at you like, assuming that you will hold them accountable,
right?
Or that they will hold, you know, but you know, not vice. They don't see it as a two-way street, I suppose, often.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I really like what you said about that sense of inadequacy. I feel like that's something that's missing in our worship culture as well, of where worship leaders, I know you because you spend so much time practicing, you practice at home and then you rehearse, at the church with everybody. And so it's like there's a sense in which by the time you're getting on stage, you're like, all right, we've got it all figured out. We're ready to go. And that's really helpful to be reminded that there needs to be a sense of inadequacy there in order to heart check ourselves, and one that's even conveyed to the congregation to where they are recognizing that, so that they're not looking at us. Because I think so often we really only convey a sense of adequacy, really, that like hey, we have it all going on. Look at us because we've got it all going on, and that's something that's often missing from the pulpit and from the worship stage.
Well, a great worship team, a great worship leader can put on a show. A great speaker can be real eloquent. But one of the things I love about ministry is the thing that I desperately want to see happen is the one thing I can't actually do, and that's changing the hearts of those I minister to. Yeah. So even if I could stand up and deliver an amazing sermon, only God changes hearts. And, a worship band can entertain folks, but only God can bring people to their knees with emotion and passion and just overwhelmed with his glory and who he is. And somehow he allows us to do that through music. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, if we're relying on ourselves, it's like Psalm 127:1, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thinking back to accountability a little bit then, what does that look like? Or what would be a system or something that people could, if they're saying, hey, I don't have any accountability in my life, and maybe even specifically saying, hey, I'm struggling with sexual stuff, or I'm watching pornography or whatever. What are some actual practical things people can do? So I guess what does accountability look like apart from the celebrity, just the person in the congregation or the worship pastor?
I think most importantly is there's got to be some men or women in your life that you see regularly who can ask you those hard questions. They know your tendencies. You haven't hidden anything from them, and you're going to keep meeting with them. I've been with the same men's group here in Clemson for about 10 years. And when we first started, it was 6 a.m. at Chick-fil-A, and I had no desire to be at a group at 6 a.m. But the more I thought about my schedule, I was like, there's really no other slot where I'm sharing with other men how I'm really doing. So I think that's priority number one, is that there have to be men in your life or women in your life that really know you, and they know the rock bottom moments in your life, and they've got to know, hey, what are you battling this week? Certainly beyond that, there are digital things that we can use. I've used Covenant Eyes for years, and had Covenant Eyes on my phone and on my internet devices. One of the challenges you see with somebody like Ravi is that there's so much technology around. There's really not a silver bullet technological solution to prevent, whether it's texting or just the amount of pornography that's actually available. So there's also that reality that if you want to shirk accountability, you probably can do it.
Yeah.
And you see that in the life of Ravi, if he was carrying around 3 phones. And in fact, they even said in the investigation that after 2017, he had gotten a lot better at covering his tracks, because 2017 was one of the first accusations that came at him. And so that was profound to me, to realize there's really not a silver bullet on accountability. So in some sense, you have to be willing to put yourself in accountability with other men and women in your life. And I would say this too, for those listening, if you're like, I've got nobody, and maybe you're in a church right now, but with COVID, you haven't been seeing people, I would just challenge you, add it to your prayer list. Would that be at the top of your prayer list? Lord, I need some men. Lord, I need some women. I need a small group. Then be willing to put yourself out there. And of course, right now, that small group might be Zoom, which is not ideal. But you and I need men in our life who actually know what we're doing and can speak into that.
Yeah. And I would just say, even though these things can all be, like you said, there's no silver bullet. These things can all be skirted around as needed. I know, personally, it's still very valuable to have systems and have meetings set up, because you can always just lie to somebody when you're meeting up with a group of men, but it's still really valuable. So Logan and I meet up on a weekly basis. We actually have a checklist of questions that we go through and we fill out, and we talk about it back and forth. And so the idea behind the written out checklist was, one, we evaluate a number of different things about how we're spending our time and leading our families and things like that, and we re-rate them and try to look for growth and things like that. But there's questions on there specifically about, have you viewed sexually explicit material? Have you been in a compromising situation with someone of the opposite gender? And those questions are on there, and it's meant to be like, this is not a gotcha type of thing. We're not trying to like spring something on you and get you. It's meant to be something where you're being asked this every week. And so at some point, those questions are just constantly going through your mind, where you're always thinking about, I need to be watching to make sure I'm not in a compromising situation where I'm with somebody at work of the opposite gender alone, because this is something I get asked about every single week. And it just helps it to stay in my mind of knowing that I've got somebody who cares and who's going to ask me about that. And that's been kind of the heart behind how we've been doing it. And I mean, even outside of this kind of stuff, it's been very beneficial, where we look at stuff like, have you been confessing your sins and crying out to God for forgiveness and stuff, things that you might not think about doing apart from having somebody ask you every single week, are you doing these things? And so I would just encourage people, like, there like you said, there are ways around everything, but not an excuse to just not set anything up.
Definitely not. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you there. Yeah. I think one of the other factors when you look at some of these bigger Christians who have fallen, and one of the challenges with the celebrity Christian, one of the ingredients to a scandal like this that I think is present in a lot of our lives is the issue of travel. And just what travel allowed somebody like Ravi Zacharias to do. Or oftentimes, as I lead men's groups in my church, they'll say that travel is one of their biggest times of temptation, because it grants them that anonymity. And so here around Clemson, South Carolina, there's a lot of international companies where people, if they work for Bosch or they work for some of the, like Frigidaire, or some of these companies that have plants in Mexico and Germany, and you have men that, as a regular part of their year, they got to travel to these other countries. Then you're in a hotel all by yourself. Nobody knows you. If you want to go to a hotel bar and just drink way too much, probably no one in your church will find out if you're in a different state or a different country. And, just that anonymity of travel, to me, that's a big factor. So if you have in your life consistent business or work travel where you're alone, that's another place where you really have to ramp up the accountability. So I've got some peers who they'll text a small group of men when they have a business trip. Here's the dates. I'm going to be out of town. Can you check on me when I'm there? And also, will you text me when I get home? Because they know that that's a time of vulnerability. And one of my other friends, which I really thought was hilarious, he would call the hotel and he would say, "It's against my religion to have a TV in the room. Will you remove it?" And what's against his religion is looking at pornography and violating his marriage vows, and dishonoring God. Yeah. But he was willing to tell them that, and they would remove it. And so it wouldn't even be an option for him when he's in the hotel room. And I just thought that was very proactive, and it was very profound. But travel is an area that is very challenging.
Yeah. And what was going through my mind when you were talking about travel and anonymity, I was like, man, I mean, effectively, we can travel anywhere we want online all of the time now. Yeah. And gosh, what a danger that is then.
Right.
You have the option to be anonymous basically 24/7 now online. So it's definitely dangerous. But I definitely see what you're saying about with physical travel. And my understanding is that, especially with Ravi, that was a main point of it. And so that's part of why I think that idea of having those strict rules of just never being in a compromising situation with someone else is also important. Even if you are saying in your heart, I have no intentions of anything, just living above reproach in that manner of just never being alone with someone of the opposite gender that's been one of the rules that I've had to put into my life, to just be like, it's not worth there being temptations there that are going to lead down a wrong path.
And back in December, when RZIM issued their initial statement, they had really hoped that this investigation would clear Ravi's name. But there were all these accusations out there, and the thing from the get-go that they couldn't say was that he hadn't been alone with all of those women. And, for a ministry that generates $25 million a year, I just said to myself, they didn't have a paid staffer or two paid staffers who were always there, so that if these were false accusations, then their team could look at his calendar and say, no, look, he was never alone in that situation. So this accusation is not true. But he was putting himself in those situations, and he was doing it for years and years. And I'm with you that is we call it the Billy Graham rule, where, Billy Graham, due to his celebrity and also just, I think he had an honesty about his own heart. That it wasn't that, I don't think he was afraid of women. He understood what's the impact of power that he had over people due to his Christian celebrity. And why should he put himself in a situation where he could compromise a woman?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, let's think about it a little bit then from the standpoint of someone seeing this in someone else, right? If we are maybe, let's say we've started some accountability and we're seeing failures in somebody that we're being, helping hold accountable, or maybe it's a leader in our church and we're a member of a congregation. Is that something that, did Ravi have anybody speaking into his life, or is that something that, is it just not possible to be done well? What are your thoughts on that? How can we do that?
So there's been no indication that he did have a team or people that were giving him direct accountability. And that's probably one of the bigger question marks a lot of us have now looking back. We know hindsight is 20/20. But absolutely, somebody in any of our positions needs some people in our life. But in a particular ministry situation like that, where you're traveling all the time, you have this tremendous influence and power, you are going to need a team who are really invested into helping make sure what did happen didn't happen. So it's definitely possible. How do you speak into, this is one of the things I would hope that your church has a structure and a leadership board. So say it's a pastor or an assistant pastor, that there's a leadership board that if there's a legitimate concern or question, these sorts of things will be addressed. And one of the challenge with somebody who has a tremendous influence and power is if they're a master manipulator, they can often explain it away. And so when that first accusation came out in 2017, Ravi said, I just need to be more careful who I develop a relationship with and communicate. And that was how he explained these accusations that were coming his way. And we really bought it. Those of us who heard that explanation, we bought his side of it because of his stage presence. We believed what he was saying. We weren't willing to ask the questions that now we look back and say we really should have been asking.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, one of the helpful takeaways I hope people will get is to start accountability now, hopefully before these things become an issue, because there are many people in our church where if I had to go and say something to them, I'm sure it would be terribly awkward and poorly received, and nothing good would come of it. Whereas like Logan and I that are meeting and asking these things early on, like we've formed that relationship now to where, Logan and I will challenge each other on stuff all the time, and it's become a healthy thing, not just something of recoil. And so hopefully that allows it to be something where you can address things before they grow into this massive issue where you're having to, some random congregation members approaching the head pastor about something. So that would be my hope.
And, it's one thing to say this is a difficult conversation and it's awkward, but I just think of Hebrews 3:13. It says, exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And to realize that if I see something in your life or you see something in my life, the potential impact of us not addressing it is catastrophic, generational.
Yeah.
I think of my wife and my children. If you had an opportunity to check me at a time before I had gone well across the line, and you could have stepped in and said something, man, what an impact that could have. But if you just say, well, that's awkward, and I'm sure he's totally fine. And as I think of my life in ministry, and I work with college students, there are plenty of times that I can think back and say, I should have said something to that guy. There's not really a lot of times I can think of that I really regret asking hard questions, having difficult conversations. I've had some people get mad at me, but I've had a lot of young men thank me. And there's been men in my life who have told me things, and it's been hard to hear. But the instances that I can remember, I've both times, or some of the instances that specifically come to mind, I've thought, man, he's right. He's right, and I need to address that. And how beautiful that is when someone comes alongside us and prevents us from going the route that Satan wants us to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I remember in college being frustrated about how often you asked me about reading the Bible, and trying to convince me I needed to read it all the way through, and here we are. So,
all right,
there's obviously some good stuff, but yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to spring a question on you that I didn't really prepare you for. This was something I texted you about actually a few days ago.
Uh-oh.
But what would you say to somebody then who says, it's not going to progress to that. This is just my thorn in the flesh, so to speak. This is something that I'm just going to deal with. It's my thing to deal with, and that's just the way that it is. What's your gut reaction response that we could say to someone like that?
Gut reaction is you really overestimate your flesh and you underestimate sin. That the direction that it is taking you, sin leads to death. That's what Romans 6 tells us. It's almost like if I said to you, hey, I've got a little bit of cancer, but it's not in any vital organs, and yeah, the surgeon could just remove it, but that's painful, and I'd rather just let it hang out there. Most of us would say, man, you better deal with that, because that's going to grow and it's going to be a problem. And I think that's kind of the route that I would take it. And I do love that Hebrews 3 verse, because it talks about the deceitfulness of sin, and that's kind of what that person is expressing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. To me, my mind with that goes to, I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked a lot about cheap grace, and this idea of us always saying we look to God and his forgiveness as if it was a cheap price to pay, and we don't recognize the severity of the cross effectively, and so we think of God purely as a God of forgiveness, and then therefore don't recognize that that ought to lead to a life change, because once we recognize that it's not a cheap thing, that it's actually something that was very, very costly. And so to me, that's part of the main issue that we have whenever there's something like an ongoing sin where we focus on that aspect of God and just cheapen the cross. I don't know another way to put it well, but that to me is one of the main things with that idea of saying that this is just my my thorn in the flesh, so to speak. And it's also one of those things where like you mentioned, that's a slippery slope to which, at which point, what sin is not then, and how would you denounce sin of any kind if you can look at it and just say, oh, this is just a struggle that I've been given and I'll always have that. You're really saying that there is no power in Christ to overcome your flesh at all.
And almost the entire book of 1 John is addressing that with the Gnostic heresy of, sin is okay, it's a physical thing, God's life is spiritual, there's a spiritual life. But in chapter 3 and verse 6, he said, no one who abides in him keeps on sinning. Anyone who keeps on sinning has never seen him or known him. And just that, if anybody even has that attitude of just, this sin is okay, I'll just hang on to it, then I have some questions about whether they truly understand what salvation is. And like I mentioned Romans 6 a minute ago, but it starts out with, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. And I think we hear it a lot with the younger generation saying, it's okay, there's grace. Now, I guess I say younger generation. I heard that a lot in college, so it's not so much the younger generation. But
you're still a younger generation, yeah.
Yeah, there was this idea that it's okay, there's grace. But the grace of God, what I really like, has one pastor put it, the grace of God does not say it's okay to sin. It's the grace of God that is propelling us into this life of holiness.
Yeah, and as you continue reading in Romans, there's a theme that starts to come out with the idea of the spirit and a warring between your flesh and spirit. And there's this idea that we ought to be putting, basically putting our sin to death. And so it's hard for me to reconcile that you could have any sin of any kind, even if you're just saying, oh, it's just this one thing, that you're saying you're not warring with that you're not putting that to death in you, and yet you have the Spirit within you. So,
and maybe this is a good opportunity for all of us to read Jerry Bridges' book, Respectable Sins. And one of the things that's so profound about that book is he wrote a book about what he called respectable sins of the saints, things that we so often tolerate in our lives. He talks about gossip. He talks about complaining and not having a heart of gratitude. And as I look at my life, I'm like, okay, wow, I can let those things just ride. And then I say, well, as long as I'm not doing these big sins, and we kind of look at some of these big scandalous sins, and then I think, oh, I'm doing okay. And I've really thought that book was profound. It was super helpful in my life to say, no, I'm called to put to death all sins. And this is a great reminder to reevaluate and to continue on in that.
Yeah, gosh, how dare we look at these sins of Ravi and then effectively say, yeah, well, at least I didn't do that, and yet be steeped in pride and like you said, bitterness or unthankfulness and things like that. So that's really helpful. We'll definitely have to try to put a shout out in the notes or something to that book, because that would be probably something really helpful for people then.
Yeah.
Well, one last question then, because I want to kind of talk a little bit about what if it's too late. So what if we've got somebody listening and they realize I'm already on this path, maybe not all the way down it, but they're saying, this is not something where I can just throw up guards so I don't get on the path. I'm on the path in maybe specifically sexual sin, but it could be other things as well, where they see footholds, they see hidden sins and things in their life. What would you say? What could they do now?
Well, if they're aware of it, then that's really profound. And the reality is that there is hope, that God has been in the business of redeeming brokenness for as long as there has been brokenness. And this is what the church is all about. And so for that person, wow, first we confess those sins to the Lord. We bring them into the light. But then we've got to get help. And one of my favorite phrasings in helping addicts is, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So if you don't reach out and find some people who can come alongside and help you, if you don't make some major changes in your life, and a quick example from a drug addiction scenario, if you're still living in the neighborhood hanging out with all the drug addicts, it's going to be very, very difficult to change. So there's going to need to be some significant change that takes place. But I would challenge you to pray for, find a group, find a counselor that can help exactly with those things that you're struggling with. If you keep it hidden, the chance of healing is very, very low. Hiding does not lead to healing. But in confession and in bringing it in front of others, that's where we can really see some powerful change take place. There are a lot of groups you could reach out to. I think the Samson Society is a phenomenal group for men. Celebrate Recovery is another one that meets continually. There are 12-step programs. There are lots of powerful things that God is using. Sometimes they're connected directly to a local church. Sometimes they're just in a community setting.
What can local churches do to help these people that are in their congregation, both those that are recognizing this and maybe even those that are not recognizing these types of sins in their life?
Man, I think that's a whole nother podcast. You're going to get me going here on that. I think one of the challenges in the church is we've often treated sex as a taboo, and it's not something we want to talk about. And, some scenarios that I've heard is if somebody brings up sexual sin, the church can immediately say, well, hey, you need to find a counselor for that. Like, we'll connect you with a counselor. And we can communicate that the church doesn't address some of these broken things. But I think the gospel of Jesus is meant to directly talk about some of these things. I love how in John 4, when Jesus meets the woman at the well, and she has a very difficult background, whether she was abused or she was promiscuous, it's one of those two. Either way, Jesus doesn't shy away from it. He goes there. He asks the hard questions, and she doesn't want to talk about that. But that was where he offered her living water. So I think for the church to understand, we have a golden gospel opportunity if we're willing to first confess our sins, and we don't want to be the Pharisees and say we're all clean and holy and mighty. One, for Christians, we need to be able to talk about our sexual sin. That's why I think sharing my testimony of addiction and hearing students be able to share their stories, it's really powerful because it opens up the door for others to share and realize that the gospel speaks into that stuff.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, I don't want to start us off on a whole nother podcast like you mentioned. I'm sure you have a lot of other good resources and stuff on your channel for that sort of thing. So we'll definitely link some stuff to send people over there. Are there any specific resources that you want to leave people with, either videos on your channel or books that you'd recommend or anything like that you would say for getting more help or more information?
I'm all about small group men's studies and women's studies. I mean, I wrote one called War of the Soul. It's an 8-week small group. That one has been very helpful for the groups that I have led. The Conquer series is another great one for men that I think churches can use. Author Julie Slattery has a number of books for women that she's developed quite a few curriculum guides for women to put together in the church. So for me, I'm all about churches doing some of these small groups that get men and women connected and accountability, get them sharing some of those struggles that they're having, and that can really have a powerful influence, especially at a time like now with COVID, where we're spending more time on screens, we're spending more time isolated. I don't have any statistics on it yet, but I imagine that addictions have really flourished in this season of isolation.
Yeah, I bet. Well, Jason, it's been really helpful to have you on today for the podcast. This has been a really helpful discussion. I hope something that'll be helpful for other people, and especially those in places of leadership that are tempted toward that celebrity pride culture that comes along with it, but also those within the congregation, since this really is something that sweeps broadly, even within the church. So hopefully that'll be a helpful conversation, and we'll definitely link out to some of those resources and things like that so that people can be looking for more information. And obviously, if somebody's listening to this and you are struggling and you want to talk to somebody about or get pointed to some of these types of resources, feel free to reach out to us. The best way to reach to us is via email. You can reach us at team, that's TEAM, @tothechoirmaster.com. And then we're also on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. So feel free to reach out to us as well. But obviously, as Jason said, the best place to go would be your local church, and to go and start getting involved in accountability, getting involved in men's and women's groups. And so we'll definitely want to push people that direction. But yeah, Jason, it's been great having you on the podcast. And who knows, maybe there will be another podcast where we look at some of that stuff in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew. Really enjoyed it.